Well, friends, if you have your scriptures, would you turn with me, please, to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and we'll read this morning verses 14 to 18. 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 14 to 18. Now we exhort you, brethren, warn those who are unruly, comfort the faint-hearted, uphold the weak, be patient with all. See that no one renders evil for evil to anyone, but always pursue the commands which you have recorded for us in your word, and that you might write them on our hearts, that we might rejoice in them, and that we might seek with your help to obey them. We pray in our Saviour's name. Amen. Well, friends, the results are in. The study has been done. And after all the research has been completed, it's now official. We now know who are the happiest people on the earth. According to a 3-year study conducted by the UN between 2010 and 2012, the happiest people on the earth are those who are, wait for it, from Denmark. Yes, Denmark has the citizens which are most inclined to be happy. And Norway, Switzerland, the Netherlands and Sweden round out the top 5. Australia comes in at number 10. And apparently we are happier than those in the United States who are listed at number 17. And also the UK who are listed at number 22, and also those from China who are ranked at number 93. And many factors contributed to the overall sense of people's level of happiness in their lives, or unhappiness, we might say. Financial security. Although the survey found that once you reached a certain level of income, happiness no longer increased along with that income. The job security was also a factor. Family stability was a factor. Physical well-being, emotional well-being were all factors which contributed to a person's sense of happiness. But it seems apparently that happiness can be a very fickle thing, a very fleeting thing, a very unstable thing. For I just read the other day that a similar survey, released just in the last few days, has shown that actually the citizens of South America and Latin America are the happiest people in the world. With people from Paraguay topping the list, followed by those from Panama and Guatemala and Nicaragua and Ecuador. I guess it all depends on how you measure happiness. Now, as Christians, we know who, in theory, should be the happiest people in the world. We know it should be the people of God, but why should that be? It's a question we need to ask as we come to the verse which is the focus for our passage this morning. It's one verse, it's 2 words. It's verse 16 of chapter 5. Rejoice always. Over recent months we've seen the other commands that Paul gives to the people of God in Thessalonica in this passage in chapter 5. Commands how they are to relate to the leaders of the local church. Commands how they are to relate to those other members in the church, those who are unruly, who are faint-hearted, who are weak. We've seen the command to be patient. We mentioned briefly last time the command not to return evil for evil to one another, but now we come to yet another difficult command. Rejoice always. And in our time together this morning, I'd simply like us to look at 2 things in connection with this command. Firstly, what does Paul mean here? Because there are different types of rejoicing. And that's the first thing I'd like us to look at, the types of rejoicing. Which of those types Paul is referring to here? And secondly, I'd like us to look at the grounds for our rejoicing. What reasons do we have for rejoicing always? Let's look at the first one. The kinds or the types of rejoicing. As I said before, all rejoicing is not of the same nature, is it? Indeed, the scriptures speak of at least 3 different kinds of rejoicing that human beings may experience. We can lump them into 3 broad categories. And so if we know how we are to fulfill this command to rejoice always, we need to know precisely what kind of rejoicing Paul is talking about here. Now, one of those types we can rule out immediately. For the scriptures sometimes speak about carnal joy. Joy which is actually sinful. It's that measure of delight which human beings experience when they sin or when they see others sin. And the scriptures actually warn us against having that kind of joy. For example, Proverbs chapter 2 verse 14 speaks of those who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perversity of the wicked. Proverbs 24:17, we're told, do not rejoice when your brother stumbles, when your enemy falls, and do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles. And likewise in Proverbs 17 verse 5, God warns us that he who is glad at calamity will not go unpunished. The scriptures clearly command us that there are certain things we are not to rejoice in. We are not to rejoice in sin and wickedness, or even to rejoice in misfortune or calamity when it comes upon others. And obviously then Paul is not speaking about that kind of rejoicing here in verse 16 when he says, rejoice always. There's a second kind of joy, though, that the scriptures speak about, and it's what we might call natural joy. It's that rejoicing of the heart, which is our natural response to good things or favourable circumstances. You see, given that we are all made in the image of God, there is a tendency in the heart of every human being, even those who are unconverted, to respond with delight and rejoicing when they obtain the desires of their heart, or when the circumstances are favourable towards them. For example, the book of Proverbs speaks of how mothers and fathers rejoice in the birth of their children. A natural thing. Likewise, Proverbs 23 verse 24 says that one who fathers a wise son will be glad in him. It's natural for a father to be proud of a son who pleases him. Proverbs 5 speaks of rejoicing in the life of your youth. Natural joy. And the book of Ecclesiastes mentions those who rejoice in the labour of their own hands, who find satisfaction in working hard and accomplishing that which they set out to do. You see, friends, it's entirely normal for people to delight in these and a whole host of other things, isn't it? Indeed, such joy springs up from the human heart naturally. It's a natural response. It doesn't need to be commanded. And such joy in these things in and of itself, that it's not a sinful joy in and of itself. But again, this natural joy is not what Paul is speaking about here in verse 16. Why? How do we know that? Because the very word he uses after the word rejoice. What does he say? He says, rejoice always. It implies, doesn't it, that for us to fulfill this command to rejoice, there must be grounds for our rejoicing which are always there. There must be things and circumstances which are unchangeable. Things which are and will always be a cause of rejoicing for us. But the sources of natural joy aren't like that. For they're based on temporary things. They're based on things which are variable and changeable. Things which ultimately do not last. The children in which parents delighted in at birth sometimes become men and women who grieve their parents' hearts and make them ashamed. The spouse that we found such delight in throughout our lives dies. The work which we enjoyed so much suddenly ceases to exist, and we find that we're unemployed. Faithful friends who prove such a blessing to us sometimes turn and forsake us. Money and wealth suddenly, as the scriptures say, grow wings and fly away. The property or possession which we worked hard to accumulate can suddenly be lost through theft or destroyed by disasters, and the natural joy which we experienced suddenly disappears because it was dependent upon things which were only temporary. So friends, it should be obvious that when our Lord commands us here in verse 16 to rejoice always, he's not speaking in natural joy. Because if he was, we would never be able to keep this command. Natural joy doesn't last. It's a temporary joy, a changeable joy, a fickle kind of joy because it is grounded upon changeable and temporary things. Now friends, our Lord is referring to a different kind of joy altogether. He's speaking here of what we might call spiritual joy. Or to use another phrase, supernatural joy. And I use that phrase because of what Paul says over in Galatians 5:22. You know the passage, remember what he says. It's a list of the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace. You see, friends, there is a joy, there is a kind of rejoicing which is uniquely the work of the Spirit of God in our lives. It is a kind of joy which doesn't come naturally to people, but which can only be known by those who have truly been born again by the Spirit of God. What is this joy like? Well, for one, as we've seen, it's a kind of joy which really is able to be exercised always, as we are commanded to do here in 1 Thessalonians 5. It is a joy which can be known at all times and under all conditions and in all circumstances of life. And it can be known in such circumstances because it is a joy which is independent of those circumstances. But that's not to suggest for a moment that this joy comes from ignoring our circumstances. Rejoicing always doesn't mean that we forget our griefs and pain. The nature of spiritual rejoicing is not pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. It's not about spreading sunshine all over the place and put on a happy face. Although some Christians seem to think that is something of what spiritual joy looks like. No, friends, the fact is, our sorrows are real. Our griefs cut very, very deep at times, and often for long periods of time. We really do feel genuine pain and heartache over many, many things. And I'm certain that every one of us here this morning knows that all too well, because to some extent, every one of us here is presently experiencing a measure of sorrow or grief or pain, though it may differ among us. It's the very nature of life in a fallen world. We experience sorrow, and that sorrow is real. So friends, as we seek to understand this command here in 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 16, I want to encourage you not to fall into the trap of thinking, as I think most Christians tend to do as we read these words, that when Paul says, rejoice always, what he's actually saying is, sorrow never. Don't think for a moment that when Paul is saying rejoice always, he's also saying never grieve, never be sad. Because he is not saying that at all. But that's often what we think he's saying when we read those words, right? And so we read this command and then we dismiss it as either impossible to keep, or something which is unrealistic or unattainable. Or we get discouraged or we feel guilty in the midst of our sorrow because we know the scriptures say here that we should rejoice always. And our perceived disobedience only adds to that pain. And I want to encourage you to see that there is a place for sorrow in this command to rejoice always. Spiritual rejoicing is not an attempt to exclude sorrow or grief or pain from our lives or pretend that it doesn't exist. That is not what spiritual joy is all about. In fact, spiritual rejoicing coexists alongside real sorrow. In other words, it is possible for you to both rejoice always and yet experience deep sorrow at the same time. Right now, some of you are probably thinking, well, that's absolute nonsense. That is utter rubbish. How can someone both be joyful and sorrowful at the same time? It's not possible. And some of your children are probably thinking in your head, prove it. Prove it. Because I'll admit on the surface that it does sound contradictory, but I am going to prove to you that that's actually what the Bible teaches. Spiritual joy can coexist with real sorrow. We have to think back to the example that we read about in our consecutive reading this morning. And did the Lord Jesus Christ rejoice always? He's the perfect man. Of course, he rejoiced always. What did we read in verses 33 and 35, or 33 to 35 of John chapter 11? We read when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in his spirit and was troubled, and he said to them, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." And then what do we read next? Jesus wept. Here we see true grief in the life of a man who rejoiced always. Spiritual joy and genuine sorrow existed side by side in the life of the only perfect man to have ever lived. But he's not the only example. The Apostle Paul himself gives us another example, and I'd ask you to turn with me to see for yourself. 2 Corinthians 6 verse 10. Here in this passage, Paul gives a lengthy description of himself as a minister of God, and among a whole host of other things which he mentions, notice what he says in verse 10. 2 Corinthians 6 verse 10. He says, sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. Are you serious, Paul? How can you be both sorrowful and yet always rejoicing at the same time? It sounds like crazy talk. The only way for that to be possible is if spiritual joy coexists alongside real sorrow in the life of a believer, and indeed that is what true spiritual joy looks like. That's its very nature, because it is a joy which does not spring from the very things which cause us grief and sorrow. It's not grounded in things or people, things which are temporary or changeable or which pass away. It is independent of those things, as I said. And it's grounded rather in something which is sure and certain, and therefore it is a rejoicing which the Spirit can work within us regardless of our condition. In a moment we'll see what the grounds for that rejoicing are. But before we do that, I want you to look again at this command here in 1 Thessalonians 5:16 with fresh eyes, as it were, and to be encouraged by it. This command to rejoice always, which perhaps to you has always seemed so impossible, so far out of reach, so unrealistic, can actually be fulfilled even in Messiah. It can be obeyed even when you are discouraged and downhearted. Rejoicing always doesn't require or demand, as I said before, that you completely eliminate sorrow from your life. And there's a kind of rejoicing, there's a kind of joy, a true joy, a spiritual joy, even in the midst of heartache. That, of course, now raises a question: where is that joy to be found? What are the grounds for spiritual joy that enable us to rejoice always, even in the midst of sorrow? Well, as I mentioned already, in order for us to rejoice always, spiritual joy must be grounded upon something which is unchanging, which is reliable, which is certain. And not only that, it must be grounded in something which is worth rejoicing in. What then are the only grounds for our rejoicing? You know the answer. The Apostle Paul actually tells us in the parallel passage to this verse in Philippians 4, verse 4, you know this verse too. What does he say? Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I say, rejoice. Only the Lord God is the great, unchangeable one in the midst of all that is uncertain and temporary. Malachi 3:6 says, I am the Lord, I do not change. James 1:17, he's described as a father of lights with whom there is no variation or shift in shadow of turning. And unlike the creation which he has made, in which we so often seek for lasting joy, God remains the same and his years will never come to an end. And therefore, it is only in him that true spiritual joy can be found. And so in the second part of our sermon this morning, our grounds for rejoicing, I want to expand on that thought a little. What is it about God that should stir our souls to rejoice in him? What is it about the Lord that can fill our hearts with gladness and delight even when there is much cause for sorrow in our life? What are the grounds? What are the reasons we have for rejoicing in the Lord? Friends, to be honest, I'm not going to tell you anything this morning that you don't already know. But I simply want to remind you of some of the reasons the Scriptures give for rejoicing in him. I trust, friends, that we will see that we really do have much to rejoice about. We do have much to delight in. We have many reasons to be content and satisfied in God, even when our circumstances are grievous. Firstly, we have grounds for rejoicing in the Lord's character and name. Who God is in his very nature, who he is in his very being, is certainly reason enough for us to rejoice in the Lord. Yes, the very things which God does, his works, are certainly a reason for us to rejoice in him, and we'll look at some of them shortly, but even before we get to that, God himself, in his infinite perfections, in his infinite attributes, are sufficient reason for us to rejoice in him. Indeed, we could spend many, many sermons meditating on those attributes alone, but just let's pause quickly to think through a few of them. Think of his uniqueness. There is no being like him. God is the Lord, and there is no other. There is no one that even comes close to him. God has no rivals that can threaten his supremacy as the one and only God. Think on his eternity, how he has always existed. He needed no one to create him. He needs no one to sustain him. He is self-sustaining and self-existing. He's independent of all creatures. He doesn't need the help of any other being, and he will live forever. He is immortal, as we said, and his years will never come to Think of his immensity, his greatness. He's not bound by the limits of time or space, but he actually created them. Think of how he's perfect in his goodness and holiness. There's no trace of evil or wickedness in him whatsoever. Indeed, he's perfectly just and will not allow the wicked to go unpunished, and all that he does is perfect goodness. His power is limitless. No one can thwart his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" He's perfect in love, perfect in wisdom, perfect in knowledge. There is nothing which he does not know, being able to discern even the very thoughts and intents of the human heart. Indeed, turn with me for a moment to Psalm 31:17 to see how the psalmist rejoices in that particular attribute of God, his perfect knowledge or omniscience. Psalm 31 verse 17. Psalm 31 verse 7. I will be glad and rejoice in your mercy, for why you have considered my trouble, for you have seen my affliction. You have known my soul in adversities, or as another translation ends that verse, you have known the troubles of my soul. God knows. And is that not that one single attribute alone? Surely that is enough to cause us rejoicing that God knows that in whatever present circumstances or sufferings you are in, He knows them perfectly. How much more then? How much more cause for rejoicing is there when we pause to think of the wonder and greatness of God in all His perfections? Dear friends, remember, this is but a bare glimpse of what God is really doing. He has revealed Himself to us, but we cannot know Him perfectly. We cannot know Him completely. Wonder of wonders. And here is a truly astonishing truth. For those of us who are believers, this God is your God. This God has been pleased to set His love and affection upon you. This God has determined to make you His own dear child. What a staggering thought. As I trust that you can see that the very character and nature of God is sufficient reason for you to rejoice in Him, regardless of your present sorrow or circumstances. There is an unending source of joy for you, dear believer, in just pausing to remember what your God is really like. You can rejoice in His nature. We've heard in the sermon on the bear. Being of God is ground enough. But of course, that's not the only reason. That's not the only ground that believers have for rejoicing in the Lord. For secondly, we also have grounds for rejoicing in His words. For example, have you ever stopped to consider the wonders of His creation? The vastness of its size. Not just of the earth, but of the universe itself. I read recently that according to the latest estimates, and this is really just an estimate, scientists reckon that there is about 1 septillion stars in the universe. That's the number 1, followed by 24 zeros. By comparison, there are only 7.5 quintillion grains of sand on the earth, apparently. What does that mean? Put that in perspective. Well, you need 130,000 Earths to have the same number of grains of sand as there are stars in the universe. The nearest one of those stars, not including our sun, is Proxima Centauri, is 42 trillion kilometres away. If you were to drive towards it, leave from here now at a speed of 1,000 kilometres an hour, 10 times the speed limit, it would take you almost 5 million years to reach it. That's a nearest star. And the size of God's creation is beyond our comprehension, but so then too is its complexity and intricacy. And take, for example, just one of those grains of sand. In that one single grain of sand, there are more atoms than there are grains of sand on the earth. And friends, God himself, in his sovereignty, has perfect knowledge of the location of each and every one of those atoms. Not only that, but in his sovereignty he is in perfect and providential control of each and every one of those atoms. And not only that, in his perfect wisdom he planned from eternity past the course and history of every single one of those atoms. And that is true not just of the atoms in one grain of sand, but that is true of every atom that ever existed in this universe. And all his works function in perfect harmony and in full accord with his sovereign plan and purpose. Well, might we ask, with the psalmist in Psalm 8, 3 and 4. I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained. What is man that you are mindful of him? And the Son of Man that you visit him and yet wonder of wonders, friends, this majestic God, according to the book of Job, does great and unsearchable things, wonders without number. He is indeed mindful of us. So you turn with me for a moment to Psalm 139 this time. Psalm 139, 17, to see just how mindful this God is of us. Psalm 139, 17. How precious also are your thoughts to me, O God. How great is it, some of them. Verse 18, what does he say? If I should count them, they would be more in number than the sand. $7.5 quintillion grains of sand, we said. Our God is mindful of us to a degree that we cannot possibly comprehend. Friends, let the reality of those truths sink deep within the soul. Ponder for a moment just how astonishing it is. This God, who works such great and awesome wonders, is your God. This God, who is in sovereign control over this vast universe, is your God. This God who has planned such works from eternity past is your God. Is that not grounds for rejoicing? Is that not yet another reason for you to rejoice in the Lord always? It certainly was for David back in Psalm 139. Indeed, if you still have that passage open, jump back to verse 14 and notice what he says.